At 80, Harrison Ford isn't just aging. He's disappearing before our eyes. The man who gave us legends now walks in silence, forgotten by the very industry he built. Behind the fedora and the blaster was a heart we never truly saw. And now, it may be too late to understand him. The boy who built things, not dreams. Before the fame, the million-dollar movies, or even the idea of acting, Harrison Ford was just a quiet kid with a toolbox. Born in 1942 in Chicago, he didn't grow up chasing dreams. He built things with his hands, not his heart. While other kids played sports or chased the spotlight, Harrison was taking apart radios and fixing what most gave up on. His mind was mechanical. His world was silent. But inside, something stirred. Stories, feelings, a quiet hunger for more. He wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't the teacher's favorite. And he certainly wasn't the kid anyone expected to be famous. In fact, Ford once said, "I never thought I'd be a movie star. I just wanted to pay the rent." He studied philosophy in college, but not for long. He dropped out, drifted. There was no big epiphany, just odd jobs, unfinished plans, and a slow pull toward something he couldn't quite name. Acting came not from desire, but from desperation. A way to get by. A side hustle. Nothing more. By his early 20s, Harrison wasn't chasing stardom. He was just trying to survive. And what happens when survival brings you to Hollywood? It doesn't roll out the red carpet. It hands you a hammer. A nobody with a tool belt in Hollywood. In the late 60s, Harrison Ford was more likely to be found in a garage than on a movie set. He wasn't charming the press or climbing the ranks. He was fixing cabinets, hanging doors, installing bookshelves. Carpentry paid the bills. Barely. And that's how most people saw him. A handyman, not an actor. Casting agents called him too quiet, said he didn't have that spark, too shy, too rugged, not Hollywood material. But here's the twist. He built furniture for the very people who would change his life. One of them? A young director named George Lucas. Ford was in his home, building shelves, not knowing that just a few years later, he'd be piloting the Millennium Falcon. Even while doing background roles on shows like Gunsmoke and Ironside, something about him stood out. He didn't overact. He didn't try too hard. He just existed. Real, solid, grounded. As he once put it, "I'm like old shoes. I don't wear out, I just stay around." He was never flashy, but his restraint became his strength. His silence had weight. And then, out of nowhere, came a call. A second chance. A gamble. A role that would forever change Hollywood and Harrison. Because the next step wasn't just a role. It was Han Solo, and the galaxy would never be the same. Becoming Han Solo and watching the world change overnight. In 1977, Harrison Ford's world flipped upside down. One day, he was still that quiet carpenter, auditioning when he could, uncertain if Hollywood had a place for him. The next, he was Han Solo, and nothing would ever be the same again. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. George Lucas had other actors in mind, big names, proven stars. But something about Ford's grounded presence, his dry wit, his effortless cool, it stuck. He wasn't acting like Han Solo. He was Han Solo, rugged, sarcastic, emotionally guarded, and under all that, deeply loyal. "Sometimes I think I was just in the right place at the right time," Ford once said. But that's not the whole story. The world didn't just embrace Star Wars, it exploded with it. And at the center of the cultural storm stood Harrison Ford, half amused, half overwhelmed. He had spent years trying to be noticed, and now he couldn't walk down the street without being mobbed. It sounds like a dream. But for Ford, fame didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a trap. He never wanted to be idolized, never cared for the celebrity machine. Interviews bored him. Paparazzi annoyed him. Fans expected Han Solo 24/7. But Ford wasn't Han. He was a man who valued privacy, stillness, control. Stardom made that impossible. There's a strange irony in it all. The more the world fell in love with the swaggering space smuggler, the more Harrison retreated inward. He didn't chase red carpets or studio politics. He avoided the spotlight whenever he could. And when he spoke, it wasn't like a man who enjoyed attention. It was like someone enduring it. He once said, "I don't want to be a movie star. I want to be in movies." Still, he kept showing up, kept delivering. Because despite the chaos, he loved the work, the craft, the storytelling. But every time he looked in the mirror, he saw less of himself and more of what the world projected onto him. Fame had opened the doors, but it also slammed others shut. His quiet nature, once endearing, became misunderstood. Some called him aloof, others called him cold, but the truth was simpler. He just didn't want to be owned by the machine. And just when the pressure felt unbearable, another role came along. A character so different from Han Solo, yet one that demanded even more from him. Not just emotionally, but physically. Because Indiana Jones didn't just swing a whip, he bled. Indiana Jones, the hero who bled for his roles. If Han Solo made Harrison Ford a star, Indiana Jones made him a legend. The fedora, the whip, the dusty jacket, the smirk, the fear of snakes. Indiana wasn't a superhero. He wasn't invincible. And that's exactly what made him iconic. He got hurt. He limped. He bled. But he kept going. And so did Harrison. From the very beginning, Ford insisted on doing many of his own stunts. Not because it was glamorous, but because he wanted it to feel real. Every punch, every fall, every sprint, it came with risk. And pain. So much pain. It hurts now. It hurt then. But it looked good, didn't it? He once joked. On Raiders of the Lost Ark, he tore ligaments. On Temple of Doom, he herniated a disc in his back. On Last Crusade, he bruised ribs and twisted ankles. Film after film, the damage built up. But he kept pushing. For the audience, for the story, for the love of cinema. Behind the scenes, his body was breaking down, but you'd never know it. He rarely complained, rarely paused. He treated pain like background noise, a price he was willing to pay to make it real. And that's what made him different from other action stars. He didn't look bulletproof, he looked human. His face showed fear, grit, exhaustion. That vulnerability made people believe in Indy. Not just as a hero, but as a man. But while audiences cheered, Harrison's body aged faster than his years. The stunts that thrilled us were quietly destroying him. And once the cameras stopped rolling, the silence was filled with soreness, recovery, surgeries, scar tissue no one saw. It wasn't just physical either. Playing Indy came with enormous pressure. To live up to expectations. To carry billion-dollar franchises. To never show weakness, even when it hurt. It wore on him, inside and out. He never said it, but you could see it in his eyes. The fatigue, the weight, the cost. I've always been drawn to characters who are a little broken," he admitted once. "Maybe because I understand them." By the time Kingdom of the Crystal Skull came out, fans questioned whether he was too old for the role. What they didn't realize is he'd always been hurting. Age just made it visible. Still, he came back, one more time, because he didn't just play Indiana Jones, he lived him. And with every punch Indy threw, a piece of Harrison Ford was left behind. The cost of being a legend. By the time the 1990s rolled in, Harrison Ford was everywhere. The Fugitive, Air Force One, Patriot Games, hit after hit, year after year. He wasn't just a movie star anymore. He was Hollywood's most bankable leading man. But behind the box office records and magazine covers, the weight of that success was starting to show. He was no longer that quiet carpenter trying to get by. Now, every studio wanted a piece of him. Every character had to be tougher, louder, more iconic than the last. There was no time to rest, no time to reflect. Just one grueling production after another. Fame for Ford had become a job. And like most jobs, it came with burnout. Success has a dark side. You start to disappear behind the roles, he once admitted. At home, life wasn't any easier. His first 2 marriages fell apart under the weight of constant travel, press tours, and absence. He tried to be present for his children, but Hollywood doesn't pause for family. And slowly, the man who once built things with his hands began to feel like he was watching his own life fall apart from a distance. Even at the height of his stardom, something was missing. Ford rarely smiled at premieres. His interviews were short, guarded, sometimes even uncomfortable. He didn't enjoy being seen. He just knew it was part of the deal. People loved the characters he played: presidents, soldiers, cowboys. But very few people ever truly knew the man behind all that armor. He wasn't chasing legacy. He wasn't counting awards. He just wanted peace, some space to breathe, to be still, to disappear, if only for a little while. That's why, in the 2000s, Ford pulled back. Fewer movies, fewer public appearances. He bought land in Wyoming and spent more time in the woods than in front of cameras. He learned to fly. He planted trees. And for the first time in decades, he was no longer running lines. He was just being Harrison. Then, something unexpected happened. He met Callista Flockhart. She wasn't from his world of grizzled action films or galaxy-spanning adventures, but she grounded him, brought warmth into the quiet. And for the first time in a long time, Ford seemed calm. Like maybe all that pain had finally led him to something real. But even love can't undo the past. The body remembers the stunts. The heart remembers the loss. And time, no matter how strong you are, always catches up. He kept acting, but the light in his eyes had softened. The roles were still strong, but the man was growing tired. You spend so long being other people. You forget who you started out as, he once said. By now, the legend had been written. But the man underneath it? He was still searching for something quieter than fame. And just when it seemed like he might have finally found peace, his body began to betray him. The aging hero, and a body that betrayed him. Getting older happens to everyone, but when you're Harrison Ford, the face of American heroism for half a century, aging becomes a public event. By the 2010s, the damage from years of physical roles began to surface. Chronic pain, old injuries flaring back to life. But true to form, Ford didn't complain. He showed up, He worked. He did the stunts. Even on Star Wars, The Force Awakens, at age 72, he was still running down corridors, still gripping a blaster like he was 30. But during filming, a hydraulic door on set slammed onto him, breaking his leg. It halted production. He needed surgery. The pain was severe. The recovery, slow. "Stuff happens," he shrugged at a press event. "It's not the years, honey. It's the mileage." But the truth was, it was both. Years and mileage. And they were finally catching up. That same year, he survived something far worse. While flying his vintage plane, the engine failed. He crashed onto a golf course in California. Paramedics found him conscious, bloodied, but alive. It was a miracle. Broken bones, a battered face, a long recovery. He didn't talk about it much. He never really does. But after that crash, something changed. At public events, he moved slower, talked less. That quietness that once made him mysterious now looked more like fragility. He still made films, still smiled for the cameras, but the energy had shifted. There was a tremble in the voice, a heaviness in the walk. The man who once swung across chasms was now, quietly, confronting his own limits. Then in 2025, just months before the Oscars, he withdrew due to a shingles diagnosis. It hit him hard, painful, exhausting, and symbolic. Because, in a way, that absence on Hollywood's biggest night said more than any speech could. Even legends get tired. Even heroes fall silent. But Harrison Ford never asked for pity. He never played the victim. He kept flying, kept working. Because deep down, he wasn't holding on to fame. He was holding on to purpose. "I just want to keep telling stories," he once said. "As long as I can stand, I'll keep going." And that's what makes this part of his life so quietly tragic. He gave us everything: his body, his heart, his youth. And now, as age slowly takes pieces of him away, most of the world only sees the surface. The movie posters, the reboots. They forget the toll, the bruises, the surgeries, the silence. He's still here, but the fire flickers. And behind those tired eyes, you can't help but wonder, how much more does he have left to give? The Phantom of Rick Deckard, Loneliness in Sci-Fi. In 1982, Harrison Ford stepped into the shadows of the future as Rick Deckard, the weary, hollow-eyed Blade Runner hunting replicants in a rain-soaked Los Angeles. At the time, Blade Runner was seen as a misfire. Too slow, too strange, too quiet. It didn't make money. It didn't make sense to most audiences. But time changed everything. Because Blade Runner didn't just age well, it became a prophecy. And Ford's performance, so understated, so internal, became something deeper with every passing year. Deckard wasn't a traditional hero. He was lost, isolated, barely alive inside. And when you watch it now, it feels less like science fiction and more like a mirror. It was a movie about identity, Ford said years later, about what it means to be human. But the truth is, Deckard wasn't just a character. He was a reflection of Ford's quiet disconnection, of his struggle with fame, of a man growing colder in the heat of the spotlight. You could see it in the way he moved, the pauses between lines, the hollow exhaustion in his voice. It wasn't acting, it was experience. Deckard was a man worn down by systems, haunted by questions, unsure if his feelings were even real. It's no coincidence that the actor playing him often felt the same. For decades, Ford stayed silent on the film. He didn't talk about it much, didn't celebrate it like Star Wars or Indiana Jones. Maybe because it hit too close. Maybe because the loneliness of Deckard was a little too familiar. Then came Blade Runner 2049, and suddenly Ford was back, older, grayer, quieter. His scenes in that film are hard to watch without feeling a chill. He looked haunted, broken, like a ghost of his former self. The body was slower. The voice cracked. The eyes told you everything. He wasn't trying to recapture the past. He was saying goodbye to it. "Time eventually takes everything," he said in an interview, "even the things we don't want to let go of." There's a moment in 2049 where Deckard sits in silence, surrounded by memories, and the camera just lingers on his face. No dialogue, just stillness. And in that moment, you don't see a character. You see Harrison Ford, not the star, not the icon, just the man, weathered, alone, carrying decades of emotion the world never fully noticed. Blade Runner wasn't about flying cars or dystopian tech. It was about emptiness. And for Ford, that story was personal, because the deeper into the myth he went, the more of himself he lost. And now, looking back, Deckard feels like a warning. A man stripped down by time, regret, and unanswered questions. It was one of Ford's most powerful roles, and yet few ever gave it the praise it deserved. Which leads us to something even harder to swallow. What happens when someone gives everything and still isn't fully seen? The tragedy of being respected too late. For all his fame, for all the decades of iconic roles and unforgettable moments, Harrison Ford never won an Academy Award, not once. He was nominated only one time, in 1986, for Witness, a strong performance. Quiet, intimate, powerful, but he lost. And after that, Hollywood never really came back to recognize him. That's the tragedy. Because while others collected Oscars, Ford collected scars. While actors gave performances, he gave his entire body, his silence, his soul. And yet, when it came time for the industry to honor him, he was passed over. Again and again. "I never needed a trophy to know my work mattered," he once said. But still, you can't help but wonder if it hurt. Because it's not about ego, it's about acknowledgement. And Ford, who helped carry some of the most important films in history, was often left standing outside the circle of critical praise. Always the blockbuster guy, never the serious actor. Always the face, rarely the artist. By the time he received the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award, it felt almost too late. A last-minute apology from an industry that had taken so much from him. He smiled on stage, gave a humble speech, but the look in his eyes wasn't joy. It was exhaustion. "I've been lucky," he said that night, "but it took me a long time to feel seen." Because that's what it really came down to. Ford wasn't asking to be worshipped. He just wanted to be understood. Not as Han, not as Indy, but as himself. As the man who spent decades holding up Hollywood, often without thanks. While lesser actors were celebrated, Ford stayed in the shadows, kept working, kept hurting, kept going. And that kind of quiet resilience, it doesn't trend, it doesn't make headlines, but it builds legacy. His performances didn't scream, they whispered, and those whispers stuck with you. They aged well, they settled into your bones. "I'm not flashy, I just show up," Ford once said. That's what I've always done. But as time passed, and newer generations forgot the weight of what he carried, you could feel it, this slow, creeping sense that his greatness was being overlooked. Not by fans, not by those who truly knew the work, but by the very machine that once lifted him up and then moved on. And maybe that's the harshest truth of all. Sometimes the world doesn't realize what it had until it's too late. The heart beneath the leather and blaster. Most people know Harrison Ford for the hat, the whip, the blaster, the one-liners. But the most important parts of his life never made it to the big screen. Because underneath the gruff voice and action hero toughness was a man deeply human. A father, a husband, a man who loved the quiet rhythm of the outdoors more than the roar of applause. He raised 5 children, supported them without turning them into headlines. When the cameras weren't rolling, he was planting trees in Wyoming, fixing fences, flying rescue missions, helping out, staying grounded. No entourage, no ego. Nature doesn't care who you are, he once said. That's why I love it. He became a licensed pilot, not for thrill, but for purpose. He volunteered his time to rescue hikers, deliver medical supplies, and even help with emergency response. None of it was done for press. In fact, he avoided it. The work was quiet, invisible, like he wanted it. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Because while the world celebrated the myths, Han Solo, Indiana Jones, Rick Deckard, they often ignored the man who lived without needing to be a myth. A man who valued character over credit, who turned down major roles just to stay home with family, who didn't tweet, didn't post, didn't perform when the lights were off. The headlines never focused on that Ford. They preferred the spectacle. But the real Harrison Ford? He was rare. Incredibly rare. You spend decades playing other people, he once said. But the hardest part is just being yourself. He supported environmental causes before it was fashionable, sat on conservation boards, donated quietly, spoke out passionately about climate change, indigenous land rights, and preserving wildlife. But most people didn't hear that part. They just wanted another sequel. Because in Hollywood, the myth is easier to market than the man. There's something heartbreaking in that. To give your whole life to an industry and realize the version of you it loves isn't real. As Ford got older, the roles slowed, the scripts changed, but the man underneath stayed the same, wiser, quieter, stronger in ways that never needed stunt doubles. And yet, we, the audience, kept wanting more. More action, more nostalgia, more Han, more indie. But maybe what we really needed was more Harrison. Not the legend, just the human being. The man who stood in the woods with muddy boots and wind-burned cheeks. Who looked at the sky more than the screen. Who taught us that you can be great without being loud. And perhaps that's the greatest performance he ever gave. The one we never got to see. What happens when a legend grows old? He's 80 now, still walking red carpets, still giving interviews with that familiar squint and half grin, still working, but slower, softer. You can feel the change, the weight of time, the edges of his legacy starting to take shape in real time. It's hard to watch, because we don't want to let go. We grew up with him. He was the voice of rebellion, the face of courage, the eyes of doubt. His characters weren't just entertainment, they were companions, parts of our lives. And now, As Harrison Ford quietly fades into the background of his own story, we're left asking something we're not ready to answer. What happens when a legend grows old? There's no reboot for real life, no sequel that undoes time. You can't stunt double your way through aging. And Ford, ever the realist, knows this. He's accepted it with grace, with humility, but also with something harder to name: a deep, echoing solitude. Because when the spotlight dims and the crowds get smaller, what's left? A man, a body that hurts, a memory starting to slip from pop culture's grasp. In 2025, when he missed the Oscars because of illness, fans around the world held their breath. It was just shingles, they said, just a setback. But something about it felt heavier, like a chapter quietly closing. "I'm not afraid of getting old," he once said, "but I do think about how people remember." And maybe that's what makes this ending so quietly devastating. We spent decades watching him fly, punch, run, escape. But what we're seeing now is him slow down. And it's hard to watch heroes become human, because it reminds us we're all heading there too. The tragedy isn't that Harrison Ford is aging. The tragedy is that only now are we starting to understand his depth, his choices, his sacrifices, the silence between the roles, the quiet nobility of a man who never needed to explain himself, yet maybe deserved to be understood all along. He will be remembered as Han, as Indy, as Deckard, as Jack Ryan, Richard Kimball, and a dozen others. But maybe, just maybe, we'll also remember the man who gave all of himself and asked for nothing. Because when he's gone, there won't be a replacement. No reboot, no recast, no second take. Just silence. And in that silence, the echo of a life that touched generations. A legend, a phantom, a carpenter, Harrison Ford. The tragedy of Harrison Ford isn't death, it's misrecognition. A life spent giving everything, only to be celebrated for the surface, not the soul. When he's gone, the world will finally realize legends like him aren't made anymore. No reboot, no sequel, just the silence of a man we never fully knew.